On a sweltering morning in July 2023, the people of Niger woke up to news that would change their country forever. General Abdurrahmane Chiani stood before television cameras in the presidential palace, his military uniform crisp under the harsh studio lights. Behind him, the flag of Niger hung motionless in the air-conditioned room as he delivered words that would send shockwaves across the African continent and beyond. President Mohamed Bazoum was no longer in power. The man who many Nigerians viewed as nothing more than a French puppet had been removed from office along with his wife and son, all now confined to the presidential palace under heavy guard. For the first time in decades, Niger was charting its own course free from the invisible chains that had bound it to its former colonial master. The streets of Niamey erupted in celebration. Young men and women poured out of their homes, their voices rising in songs of liberation that echoed through the dusty streets. They had endured enough. For over 60 years since gaining independence in 1960, Niger had remained trapped in what many called a neo-colonial relationship with France. While French nuclear power plants hummed with electricity generated from Nigerian uranium, over 85% of Niger's own people lived without access to reliable electricity. The irony was not lost on anyone. Niger possessed some of the world's richest uranium deposits, yet remained one of the poorest countries on Earth. French companies had been extracting this precious resource for decades, shipping it thousands of miles to power French cities while Nigerian villages remained in darkness. The wealth flowed north across the Mediterranean, leaving behind only environmental damage and poverty. As news of the coup spread, crowds gathered at key locations throughout the capital. The French embassy became a focal point of popular anger, its imposing walls suddenly seeming less intimidating to the thousands of protesters who surrounded it. These were not just young revolutionaries or political activists. Elderly men who remembered the colonial era walked alongside mothers carrying babies, all united by a shared dream of true independence. The international community reacted with predictable outrage. In Paris, President Emmanuel Macron convened emergency meetings, his advisors scrambling to understand how their carefully maintained influence had crumbled so quickly. The economic community of West African states, often seen as a tool of French foreign policy, issued ultimatums and threatened military intervention. But for once, Niger refused to bow to external pressure. General Chiani wasted no time in making his intentions clear. This was not just a change of government, he declared. It was a complete rupture with the past. The defense agreements that had allowed French troops to operate freely on Nigerian soil would be terminated. The mining concessions that had enriched French corporations at Niger's expense would be reviewed. Most importantly, Niger would reclaim control over its own natural resources. The announcement sent ripples of fear through French corporate boardrooms. Orano, the state-owned nuclear fuel company that had been extracting uranium from Niger since 1971, suddenly found its future uncertain. For over 50 years, they had operated with virtual impunity, extracting far more uranium than their shareholding entitled them to, while leaving Niger's state mining company as a junior partner in their own country's wealth. In the suburbs of Paris, where many African immigrants lived, the news was received with quiet satisfaction. They had watched for years as their home country's resources were extracted to benefit France, while their families back home struggled in poverty. Finally, one country had said enough. But this was just the beginning. The real test would come, not in the excitement of revolutionary fervor, but in the long, difficult months ahead. France had never willingly given up its economic dominance in West Africa, and Niger was about to discover just how far their former colonial master would go to maintain control over the uranium that powered a third of France's electricity grid. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the relationship between France and Africa forever. In the presidential palace, General Chiani prepared for the battle ahead, knowing that true independence would have to be fought for, not simply declared. The uranium beneath Niger's desert sands had become the symbol of this struggle, and the world was watching to see who would emerge victorious. 3 months after the coup that shook the foundations of French influence in West Africa, General Chiani made a decision that would change the geopolitical landscape of the Sahel forever. On September 16, 2023, in a ceremony that received little attention from international media but would prove historically significant, he signed his name to a document that would become known as the Charter of the Alliance of Sahel States. Standing beside him were the military leaders of Mali and Burkina Faso, two countries that had also thrown off French dominance in recent years. Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali and Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso watched as the three flags were raised together, symbolizing a new era of cooperation and mutual defense. For the first time since independence, these three nations would coordinate their military, economic, and political policies without seeking permission from Paris. The formation of this alliance sent panic through the corridors of power in France. For decades, French foreign policy in Africa had relied on a simple principle: divide and conquer. By maintaining separate bilateral relationships with individual African countries, France could play them against each other, ensuring that no unified resistance to French dominance could emerge. The alliance of Sahel states shattered this strategy completely. In the weeks following the alliance's formation, French diplomats worked frantically to isolate Niger and its new partners. They pressured other West African nations to maintain sanctions and threatened economic consequences for any country that broke ranks. The economic community of West African states, heavily influenced by French pressure, maintained its hard line against the three military governments. But the alliance members had expected this reaction. They began developing alternative trade routes and economic partnerships that bypassed traditional French-controlled networks. China and Russia, always eager to expand their influence in resource-rich Africa, welcomed the opportunity to engage with governments willing to challenge Western dominance. The impact was immediate and dramatic. In Niger, the visible signs of French influence began disappearing. The French military base that had housed over 1,000 troops was being dismantled, its personnel packing their equipment under the watchful eyes of Nigerian soldiers. The French ambassador, who had wielded enormous behind-the-scenes power during previous governments, found his phone calls going unanswered and his meetings cancelled. Most symbolically, the streets of Niamey themselves began to change. The broad avenue Charles de Gaulle, named after the French president who had overseen the transition to independence, was renamed Avenue Djibo Bakari in honor of a Nigerian independence hero. French colonial monuments throughout the capital were either removed or rededicated to victims of colonialism. These changes weren't just symbolic gestures. They represented a fundamental shift in how Niger viewed itself and its place in the world. For the first time since 1960, Nigerian leaders were making decisions based purely on what they believed was best for Niger, without constantly looking over their shoulders at Paris for approval. The uranium mines, still controlled by French company Orano, became the focal point of this new assertiveness. Niger's government announced that all mining agreements would be reviewed to ensure they provided fair value to the Nigerian people. The company that had extracted over 86% of Niger's uranium, while holding only a 63% stake, suddenly found itself under intense scrutiny. French corporate executives flew to Niamey in expensive suits, carrying briefcases full of promises and threats. They offered infrastructure projects and development aid if Niger would moderate its position. When that failed, they hinted at economic isolation and international legal challenges. But the military government remained unmoved. The turning point came when Niger's ministers announced they were taking operational control of Orano's 3 major uranium mines. This wasn't just nationalization in the traditional sense, it was a complete rejection of the colonial economic model that had governed Niger for over half a century. The message was clear. Niger's uranium would benefit Niger's people, not French nuclear reactors. International observers began to take notice. What was happening in Niger wasn't just another African military coup. It was part of a broader awakening across the continent, as countries with abundant natural resources began questioning why they remained poor, while their minerals enriched foreign shareholders. The alliance between Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso grew stronger with each passing month. Joint military exercises replaced French-led training missions. Shared intelligence networks helped combat the terrorist groups that had used French military failures as recruiting tools. Most importantly, the three countries began developing a common negotiating position for their relationships with international partners. By the end of 2023, it was clear that something fundamental had changed in West Africa. The era of unchallenged French dominance was ending, and the alliance of Sahel states was proving that African countries could chart their own course. But France was not prepared to accept this new reality without a fight, and the real confrontation was still to come. As 2024 dawned over the Sahel, the temperature of the conflict between Niger and France began rising dramatically. What had started as a political coup was transforming into an economic war that would test both countries' resolve. France, accustomed to getting its way in its former colonies, deployed its most powerful weapons: financial pressure, diplomatic isolation, and corporate litigation. The French government's first major offensive came through Orano, the nuclear giant that had grown wealthy on Nigerian uranium. Company executives, backed by teams of international lawyers, launched a coordinated legal assault designed to cripple Niger's economy. They filed complaints with the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, claiming billions in damages for what they termed illegal expropriation of their assets. But Niger's military government had anticipated this strategy. They had studied how other African countries had been brought to their knees by international legal challenges and economic sanctions. This time would be different. General Chiani's administration hired their own legal experts and began building a case that would expose decades of exploitative practices by French companies. The evidence they uncovered was damning. Internal documents showed that since 1971, Orano had systematically violated its own shareholding agreements, taking 86% of uranium production while legally entitled to only 63%. The missing uranium, worth billions of dollars over 5 decades, had been shipped to France without proper compensation to Niger's treasury. Even more explosive were the revelations about profit manipulation. Through complex financial arrangements involving subsidiaries and tax havens, Orano had minimized its reported profits in Niger while maximizing them in France. This meant that Niger, despite hosting the mines and providing the uranium, received minimal royalties and tax payments from its own natural resources. These findings were presented to the international media in a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to shift public opinion. Niger's communications team, working with sympathetic journalists and advocacy groups, painted a picture of systematic exploitation that had kept one of Africa's uranium-rich countries mired in poverty. The response from French officials was swift and defensive. They accused Niger's government of manufacturing evidence and violating international law. French President Macron, in a tense press conference, declared that France would use all available means to protect its legitimate business interests in Africa. But the damage to France's reputation was already spreading. Investigative journalists began digging deeper into French corporate practices across Africa, uncovering similar patterns of exploitation in other former colonies. What Niger had exposed wasn't just corporate greed, but a systematic pattern of neo-colonial extraction that had persisted for decades. Meanwhile, the economic pressure on Niger was intensifying. French banks froze assets belonging to Nigerian entities, citing compliance with international sanctions. European Union trade preferences were suspended, cutting off access to important markets. International development organizations, heavily influenced by French diplomatic pressure, delayed or canceled aid programs. The strategy was clear: make the cost of defying France so high that Niger's government would have no choice but to capitulate. French officials whispered to their diplomatic counterparts that the military government would collapse within months under economic pressure, allowing a more compliant leadership to be installed. But they had misunderstood the depth of Nigerian resolve. Instead of weakening support for the military government, the French economic offensive actually strengthened it. Ordinary Nigerians, seeing their country under attack, rallied behind their leaders with renewed determination. The message from France was interpreted exactly as intended: submit or suffer. Niger's response was to accelerate its economic diversification. New partnerships were forged with countries eager to challenge Western dominance in Africa. Russian companies offered technical expertise for uranium extraction. Chinese firms proposed infrastructure projects that would reduce Niger's dependence on French-controlled trade routes. Indian manufacturers expressed interest in processing Nigerian uranium for peaceful nuclear programs. The most significant development came in late 2024 when Niger formally withdrew from the Economic Community of West African States, rejecting the organization's French-influenced policies. This wasn't just a diplomatic gesture. It was a declaration that Niger would no longer allow external powers to dictate its economic relationships. The uranium mines themselves became symbols of this broader struggle. Orano's French technicians, many of whom had worked in Niger for years, found themselves increasingly isolated. Their local counterparts, trained in French universities and accustomed to French management styles, began asserting their own expertise and challenging decades of assumptions about African technical capabilities. By mid-2024, it was clear that neither side was willing to back down. France had committed too much political capital to the confrontation to simply accept defeat. Niger had come too far in asserting its sovereignty to return to the old colonial relationship. The stage was set for an even more dramatic escalation that would shock the international community and reshape the future of African resource control. The uranium that had powered French cities for decades was about to become the catalyst for a complete transformation of Franco-African relations, and neither Paris nor Niamey was prepared for where this confrontation would ultimately lead. The morning of June 19, 2025, began like any other in Niger's capital, but by evening the entire world would be talking about what happened in a government meeting room in Niamey. General Chiani called his council of ministers together for what would become one of the most consequential decisions in modern African history. The agenda had only one item: the complete nationalization of Niger's uranium industry. For months, the standoff with France had been escalating. Orano's attempts to maintain control of the uranium mines had grown increasingly desperate. The company had withdrawn French personnel without notice, attempted to shut down production during board meetings, and even disconnected the mine's computer systems in a final act of spite. But instead of forcing Niger to capitulate, these actions had only strengthened the government's resolve. The cabinet meeting lasted for hours as ministers debated the implications of their decision. They knew that nationalizing Orano's operations would trigger the most severe international crisis Niger had faced since independence. France would not simply accept the loss of assets worth billions of dollars. The European Union would likely impose crushing sanctions. International arbitrators would side with a major Western corporation against a small African country. But as the discussion continued, one fact became undeniable: Niger had nothing left to lose. The French economic offensive had already isolated the country internationally. Orano had already demonstrated its willingness to sabotage operations rather than operate under Nigerian authority. The colonial economic relationship that had impoverished Niger for 6 decades was ending anyway, with or without a dramatic gesture. When the vote was called, the result was unanimous. Niger would nationalize the Société des Mines de l'Air, known as SOMAIR, along with all of Orano's other uranium operations in the country. But this wouldn't be a quiet bureaucratic process. The government decided to announce the decision on national television, ensuring that every Nigerian would understand the historic significance of the moment. The announcement was broadcast live across the country as government spokesmen read the official statement. The language was deliberately confrontational, accusing Orano of irresponsible, illegal, and unfair behavior, and describing France as a state that had been openly hostile toward Niger since July 26, 2023. The message was clear. This wasn't just an economic decision. It was an act of war against neo-colonialism itself. The reaction in Paris was immediate and furious. French officials, caught off guard by the boldness of Niger's action, scrambled to coordinate a response. Emergency meetings were called at the Élysée Palace as President Macron consulted with his advisors about how to respond to what many were calling the most serious challenge to French interests in Africa since decolonization. Orano's executives watching the announcement from their headquarters in Paris, realized that decades of comfortable profits from African uranium were ending. The company immediately issued statements threatening legal action and demanding compensation for all damages. But privately, many acknowledged that their strategy of confrontation had backfired spectacularly. The timing of Niger's announcement was particularly significant because it coincided with growing international awareness of resource extraction inequalities across Africa. Social media campaigns highlighting the contrast between Niger's poverty and France's uranium-powered prosperity had been gaining momentum for months. Niger's government had chosen the perfect moment to strike. Within hours of the announcement, demonstrations erupted across Niger in support of the nationalization. In the uranium mining town of Arlit, workers who had spent their careers enriching, foreign shareholders celebrated the prospect of finally benefiting from their own labor. In Niamey, university students organized rallies praising the government for taking control of Niger's destiny. But the celebration was tempered by awareness of what lay ahead. Niger's leaders knew that France would not accept this defeat gracefully. The country would need to prepare for an intensified economic siege, diplomatic isolation, and possibly even covert destabilization efforts. The uranium mines themselves would need to continue operating under Nigerian management, proving that African technical expertise could succeed without French oversight. The international response was swift and predictable. Western governments condemned the nationalization as a violation of international law and property rights. The European Union announced it was considering additional sanctions. American officials expressed concern about the precedent being set for international investments in developing countries. But there were also voices of support. African governments, even those traditionally aligned with France, found it difficult to publicly condemn a country for asserting sovereignty over its own natural resources. Progressive organizations worldwide praised Niger for challenging decades of exploitative arrangements. Even some French intellectuals acknowledged that their country's African policies had been unsustainable. The most significant response came from Niger's partners in the alliance of Sahel states. Mali and Burkina Faso immediately announced their full support for the nationalization, with both countries hinting that they might take similar actions against French companies operating in their territories. What had begun as Niger's fight was becoming a regional revolution. As night fell on June 19, 2025, the uranium mines in Niger's desert continued their steady hum of production. But for the first time in over 50 years, that uranium would be extracted purely for Niger's benefit. The revenues would flow to Nigerian communities rather than French shareholders. The technical expertise would be developed by Nigerian engineers rather than French expatriates. The final confrontation between Niger and France was about to begin, and the entire world was watching to see whether a small African country could successfully challenge one of the world's former colonial powers. The uranium beneath the Sahara had become the symbol of a new kind of African independence, and there would be no turning back. The aftermath of Niger's uranium nationalization created ripple effects that extended far beyond the borders of the Sahel. In capitals across the world, governments were forced to choose sides in what was rapidly becoming a defining moment in the relationship between the developed and developing worlds. The stakes had never been higher, and neutrality was no longer an option. In Washington, American officials found themselves in an uncomfortable position. The United States had its own significant interests in Niger, including military bases and counterterrorism partnerships. But the uranium crisis was fundamentally about French colonial practices, making it difficult for America to take a strong public stance either way. Behind closed doors, some American strategists actually welcomed the weakening of French influence, seeing it as an opportunity to expand their own partnerships in West Africa. The African Union faced an even more complex dilemma. While many member states privately sympathized with Niger's position, they were also concerned about the precedent of nationalizing foreign investments without compensation. Countries with significant foreign mining operations worried about triggering similar confrontations with international corporations. But the moral argument was difficult to ignore. How could African leaders condemn another African country for asserting control over its own natural resources? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. South Africa, led by a government that had its own complicated history with resource extraction, became the first major African power to explicitly support Niger's actions. President Cyril Ramaphosa, speaking at a press conference in Cape Town, declared that the era of African resources enriching foreign shareholders while African people remain poor must come to an end. This statement opened the floodgates for similar declarations across the continent. Ghana, which had recently renegotiated its own mining agreements, praised Niger's courage. Nigeria, Niger's giant neighbor, quietly began reviewing its own relationships with international oil companies. Even Kenya and Tanzania, traditionally moderate voices in African politics, expressed understanding for Niger's position. The momentum was building for what some observers began calling the Niger Doctrine, the principle that African countries had the right to prioritize their own development over foreign corporate profits. Mining companies across the continent suddenly found themselves facing more assertive governments and skeptical public opinions. In Europe, the response was more fractured. While European Union officials dutifully condemned the nationalization, several member countries privately questioned whether France's aggressive stance was wise. Germany, heavily dependent on Russian energy before the Ukraine crisis, understood the importance of diversifying uranium supplies. Some German officials quietly explored whether they could work directly with Niger's new state-controlled uranium company. The most dramatic response came from an entirely unexpected quarter. China, which had been watching the crisis unfold with interest, suddenly announced a major infrastructure investment package for Niger. The timing was clearly intended to send a message. Countries that challenged Western dominance would not stand alone. Chinese engineers and technicians began arriving in Niger to help operate the nationalized uranium mines. Russia, never one to miss an opportunity to challenge Western interests, went even further. Moscow announced that Russian nuclear technology companies were prepared to help Niger develop its uranium industry independently of French expertise. This wasn't just economic competition, it was a direct challenge to French technological dominance in Niger. The corporate world was watching these developments with growing alarm. If Niger could successfully nationalize foreign-owned assets without facing crippling consequences, it would encourage similar actions elsewhere. Mining executives in boardrooms from London to Toronto began reviewing their African operations, wondering which countries might follow Niger's example. Orano found itself increasingly isolated as the crisis deepened. The company's legal challenges were moving slowly through international arbitration systems, while Niger's government continued operating the mines successfully. More damaging to Orano's position was the growing evidence of the company's historical exploitation of Niger, which made it difficult to generate international sympathy. The most unexpected development came when several French civil society organizations publicly supported Niger's position. Environmental groups highlighted the ecological damage caused by decades of uranium mining without adequate restoration. Human rights organizations documented the health impacts on local communities who had never benefited from the wealth extracted from their land. This domestic criticism created a political problem for the French government. President Macron found himself defending corporate interests that many French citizens viewed as morally questionable. Opinion polls showed that a significant minority of French people actually supported Niger's right to control its own resources, creating constraints on how aggressively France could respond. By late 2025, the international landscape had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a bilateral dispute between Niger and France had become a global conversation about resource justice and economic sovereignty. Developing countries around the world were emboldened to challenge exploitative agreements with international corporations. The uranium mines in Niger continued operating under local management, proving that African technical expertise was more than capable of handling complex industrial processes. Production levels actually increased as Nigerian engineers, no longer constrained by French corporate priorities, optimized operations for local benefit rather than foreign profit maximization. Niger's success was inspiring similar movements across Africa and beyond. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, cobalt miners were demanding a greater share of profits from their labor. In Zambia, copper mining agreements were being renegotiated. From Ghana's gold fields to Botswana's diamond mines, the Niger model was being studied and adapted. The final phase of the confrontation was about to begin, and it would determine whether Niger's bold gambit would inspire a continental transformation or serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging established international economic relationships. The entire world was waiting to see what would happen next. 2 years after the coup that changed everything, Niger stood transformed. The country that had once been dismissed as one of France's most reliable client states had become a symbol of African independence and self-determination. The uranium mines that had enriched French shareholders for over 50 years now powered Niger's own development, funding schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects that were finally bringing prosperity to ordinary Nigerian citizens. The transformation was visible everywhere. In the capital city of Niamey, construction cranes dominated the skyline as new buildings rose from formerly empty lots. The electricity grid, powered by Niger's own uranium-fueled reactors built with Chinese and Russian assistance, now reached rural communities that had never seen electric lights. Most symbolically, the streets once named after French colonial figures now bore the names of African heroes and independence leaders. General Chiani, now widely regarded as one of Africa's most successful leaders, reflected on the journey during a speech marking the second anniversary of the revolution. Standing before a crowd of thousands in Liberation Square, formerly Place de la République, he reminded his audience of how far they had traveled from those uncertain days of July 2023. The economic statistics told the story of Niger's transformation. Government revenues had tripled as uranium profits flowed directly to the national treasury instead of French corporate accounts. The poverty rate had dropped by 30% in just 2 years. Most remarkably, over 60% of Nigerian communities now had access to electricity, compared to less than 15% before the nationalization. The success hadn't come without costs. France had indeed imposed severe sanctions and worked to isolate Niger diplomatically. International arbitrators had ruled against Niger in several cases, ordering billions in compensation to Orano and other French companies. But Niger's new partnerships with China, Russia, and other developing countries had more than compensated for the loss of traditional Western relationships. The alliance of Sahel states had evolved into something much more significant than its founders had originally envisioned. What began as a mutual defense pact between 3 military governments had become a comprehensive economic and political union. Mali and Burkina Faso had followed Niger's example, nationalizing their own mining operations and redirecting resource revenues toward domestic development. The alliance now included observer members from across Africa and had established its own financial institutions to facilitate trade and investment. The West African CFA franc, long seen as a symbol of French monetary control, was being phased out in favor of a new regional currency backed by the alliance's mineral wealth. Perhaps most importantly, the Niger model had spread far beyond West Africa. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a new government had renegotiated cobalt mining contracts, ensuring that more profits remained in the country. Zambia had restructured its copper industry along similar lines. Even established democracies like Ghana and Botswana had used the precedent to secure better terms from international mining companies. The global uranium market had been fundamentally altered by Niger's actions. France, which had once controlled a significant portion of global uranium supplies through its African operations, now found itself struggling to secure adequate supplies for its nuclear power program. Uranium prices had risen sharply as Niger and other African producers demanded fair market value for their resources. Orano, the company that had symbolized French economic dominance in Africa, was effectively bankrupt. The loss of Niger's uranium operations, combined with similar setbacks in other African countries, had destroyed the company's business model. The French government was being forced to nationalize Orano's remaining assets to prevent a complete collapse of France's nuclear fuel supply chain. The human impact of these changes was evident in the faces of ordinary Nigerians. In the uranium mining town of Arlit, Workers who had once labored for poverty wages while extracting wealth for foreign shareholders now enjoyed decent salaries and comprehensive benefits. Their children attended schools built with uranium revenues and dreamed of careers in engineering and technology. Educational transformation had been one of Niger's most remarkable achievements. The government had established a new university system focused on mining engineering, nuclear technology, and resource management. Young Nigerians who had once seen migration to Europe as their only path to prosperity now remained in their homeland to build careers in expanding industries. The international community had gradually accepted the new reality. Even the United States, initially critical of Niger's confrontational approach, had quietly begun engaging with the new government. American companies were exploring partnerships with Niger's state-controlled mining enterprises, recognizing that the old model of resource extraction was no longer sustainable. The success of Niger's revolution had profound implications beyond economics. It had demonstrated that small African countries could successfully challenge established international power structures if they were willing to accept short-term costs for long-term independence. The psychological impact across the continent was immeasurable, as African leaders and citizens alike realized that genuine sovereignty was possible. As the sun set over the Sahara on this historic anniversary, General Chiani concluded his speech with words that resonated across Africa and beyond. "We have proven that African resources can benefit African people. We have shown that dignity is worth more than dependency. And we have demonstrated that the future belongs to those brave enough to claim it." The uranium that had once powered French cities while leaving Nigerian communities in darkness now illuminated a new path forward for Africa. The revolution that began in Niger had become a continental awakening, and there would be no returning to the colonial relationships of the past. The age of true African independence had finally begun, and its light would shine for generations to come.